Hi everyone, I'm Ian Heller with Distribution Strategy Group, joined today by my favorite economist, geopolitical expert, and business strategist, and my friend, Alex Chausovsky. Alex, how are you today?
I'm great, Ian. Thanks for having me on the show.
You bet. We're so glad to talk to you. There's so much going on in the world right now, and I know you're all over this stuff, and I see you on stage, in the press all the time. So let's jump into a little bit and talk about some things that are happening in the world.
Yes.
So right now there's conflict between the US and Iran, there's conflict between Russia and Ukraine, there's tension between China and Taiwan, energy costs are going up, China has an energy cost advantage, there's data center madness in the US, which brings with it concerns about energy and water. And as we were talking before the show, in many ways, these things are all sort of interconnected, both in economic terms and in political terms. So why don't you give us an overview of what's happening in the world, the connections that you see, and what you see as the dangers of potential escalation or resolution?
Yeah, I think the key term that I would start off with is complexity, right? For businesses, for distributors in particular, operating in an environment where there are so many moving pieces, constant change, oftentimes by tweet, and whiplash effects, changes that happened yesterday are undone today or taken into a totally different direction. This applies economically, it applies geopolitically, it applies in the energy markets and industrial supplies all over the world. And so I think that the idea for me that kind of runs as a common thread throughout all of this is, how does a company, and specifically the company's decision makers, how can they mitigate some of these risks? How can they identify the opportunities in the case of AI and the data center build out? And how do they make sure that they create continuity of strategic thought and basically position themselves to succeed in the future? And for me, it really comes down to one simple premise, which is, if the previous approach, if we talk about the 90s, the early 2000s, even the 2010s prior to COVID, was you develop a strategy and then you focus on execution, right? That has to be the key focus. Now, I think it is no longer good enough to have a single strategy and just focus on executing. You have to war game this whole thing. You have to come up with different scenarios. You have to have the skeletal structures of a plan of how you will respond. What levers will you pull in response to these potential outcomes that could happen? For example, as we look out towards the end of 2026 to 2027, what happens to your business if the war continues throughout the end of the year in the Middle East? Oil prices go back up above $100 a barrel and stay there meaningfully. The cost of your energy increases. The cost of inputs, which is a whole separate conversation, continues to go up. How do you operate profitably? How do you make sure that it's not just revenue growth at any cost, but profitable growth? So these are the kind of ideas and concepts that I'm talking to trade associations about, to individual company leadership, and to anyone that will listen and saying, look, you have to have this wargaming mentality when it comes to succeeding in the world that's this complex.
Got it. Okay. And one subject I actually didn't bring up was tariffs. And those are often directly applicable to distributors who are sometimes the importers of the product, or at most maybe one level away from the importers who are paying the tariff tax. Now, so far, a lot of these tariffs haven't made it past federal courts or the Supreme Court, which has really mitigated the potential effects of them. But recently, President Trump passed 10% tariffs on really most of the products that get imported into the United States. I know I'm not asking you for a legal opinion, but based on what you've seen, what's going to happen to prices, to inflation, if that takes hold this time?
Yeah, I think if we were to kind of start with the historic perspective on tariffs that President Trump has had, even before he was in politics, he's always been a big believer that America is the world's biggest economy. It's the strongest economy. America has the world's strongest military. And yet we are not taking advantage of those things to the extent that we should. That means that we should be trying to get concessions both from our partners and our adversaries alike. the privilege of doing business in the U.S. market, the ability to have your shipping protected by the U.S. Navy that projects power all over the world. And so he's been very unequivocally clear about this from the beginning, is that he's a big fan of tariffs, right? We saw this in his first term, the ramp up effect, right? Now, he didn't have the support of both houses of Congress at the time. There was some pushback. It was limited in its effectiveness. But in his second term now, he's really gone all in on this concept. So whether you're talking about the Section 301 tariffs, right, that were country specific and most recently, obviously enacted at the 10 or 12.5% level, where you're talking about Section 232 tariffs that are category-specific, product-oriented tariffs, where you're talking about these reciprocal tariffs that were passed as part of Liberation Day, or any of the other sections of the tax code that are being used to negotiate. For me, it's very, very clear. We are absolutely trying to get more juice out of our trade relationships with all countries, whether they're friends or foes, and that the tariff environment will continue to evolve. They're basically the new baseline. They're not going to be removed. Even though the Supreme Court did invalidate the reciprocal tariffs, they immediately replaced them with a 10% temporary across the board. Now that's been replaced with a 301 that is country specific. And by the way, the justification for that is forced labor, which is a joke, obviously, because Western European countries do not have forced labor the way that we're saying that they do. But that's the justification that the administration is providing. So I think short term, continue to expect new types of tariffs, rulings on Section 232 investigations that have been in Congress for the better part of 2025 and the first half of 26. They are coming up now as due. In January, we instigated tariffs on semiconductors, for example, at the 25% range. Industrial machinery and robotics are on the block. Critical minerals are on the block. All of these things are still coming. And so you, as a distributor, as a decision maker, will have to operate in an environment that's constantly in flux. So the most important thing, in my view, is communication, transparency, and trust between partners, right? Whether that's on the supply side, whether it's on the customer side. I think the worst way I've seen companies handle tariffs is just blanket across the board price increases with no advance notice, made in an inopportune time frame, right? It leaves people with a really bad taste in their mouth. And, folks understand that the price of doing business is going up, that you have to raise your prices, but it's the way that you communicate that's going to be the difference between success and failure, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, at my age, I've seen tariffs go from being supported by Democrats and opposed by Republicans to a complete 180 now, where they're supported by Republicans and opposed by Democrats. I've been generally opposed to tariffs my whole life. Now, I understand there are reasons for tariffs. For example, if another country is dumping a category of goods on your economy, or they're being subsidized to a significant degree by another government, and so they have an unfair advantage, which I think you could argue is the case with Chinese electric cars.
Absolutely. Okay. Or solar panels or any other number of products that have flooded markets. Yeah, that's what Section 232 tariffs are all about at the end of the day.
Right. You're trying to level the playing field so your manufacturers aren't disadvantaged versus manufacturers in other countries. Now, if that's not the case, and it just turns out to be true that the other nation has a built-in advantage in producing a certain type of good, whether that's perhaps oil coming from Canada on a pipeline, or consumer goods from China, or apparel from China.
Right.
If you put the tariffs in place anyway, you're increasing costs for American consumers, because that's an additional cost to the channel. It either is going to come out of the margin of the manufacturer or the importer, or it's going to get passed on to the consumer. By definition, there's no other alternative.
Yes, it is a tax on American industry, no question about it.
Right.
Yeah, it's a different way of taxing the population of either consumers or businesses. It is not paid by foreign entities in any way. Now, you do affect market conditions, right? The competitive nature of foreign products versus domestically manufactured products, and this is a big part of what President Trump is trying to do, is we've come to realize that we have become dependent in some ways on supplies and materials and products from other countries. Sometimes those countries are an antithesis to what we stand for, to what we believe, right? China being a good example of this just because of the scale of our trade with the country. But so, in terms of trying to domesticate some of that production, steel production, aluminum production, production of critical minerals and resources like that, I think that there's some justification to saying we shouldn't be overly dependent on other countries like that.
I agree, and tariffs may be a good mechanism for doing that, but I don't think that logic applies to Canadian whiskey and pulp and paper and the plants that are shipping auto chassis back and forth between Canada and the U.S. So if you use it as too much of a blunt instrument, it can do more harm than good.
Yes, I fully agree with that. And I think most people underestimate the importance of the U.S.-Canada-Mexico relationship in terms of the supply chain. Most people think, oh, we're importing a bunch of stuff from Southeast Asia or from China. The reality is the biggest chunk of imports by far is from Canada and then Mexico. Those are the top two trading partners that we have. And so as I watch the way that President Trump has treated Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, Mark Carney, the prime minister of Canada, and our sometimes best partners, historically speaking, especially in the case of Canada, with the support they've always given us on military and defense initiatives, post 9/11, the way that they came to our aid in Afghanistan, in Iraq, everywhere. Certainly, in the case of Mexico, there is this issue of Chinese transshipments that needs to be addressed. I saw a really interesting statistic that basically the amount of product flowing through Mexico from China into the U.S. market is up something like 700% over the last 10 years. So there's clearly issues that we need to address. But at the end of the day, I think it's mostly an opportunistic position that President Trump finds himself in. We are so much more diversified in terms of our economy and much less exposed to the influence of imports compared to Mexico and Canada. For example, for Mexico, 30% of their GDP is exports to the US. In the case of Canada, it's like 18%. And so he recognizes, President Trump recognizes that we really have a way to put pressure on these countries to get those concessions at a level that we can't do with the Chinese or even with the Western Europeans. And I think that because of their dependence on the U.S. economy, they will largely acquiesce. Now we know, for example, we did not kind of re-up the USMCA in July as we were expecting to. Now it's going to be an annual negotiation process designed to continuously get concessions from these countries.
Yeah, so from a distributor's point of view, the uncertainty is as bad as the actual effect, because it's very difficult to plan inventory when pricing is volatile. And for a distributor, a lot of them are pursuing return on invested capital. That's represented primarily by inventory, and they are also trying to meet customer demand with proper forecasting, but that demand is affected by pricing and by the general effects on the economy that these tariffs and these changing economic policies represent. So I think what you were talking about earlier with this scenario planning or this war gaming becomes more important than ever, and I would argue that most distributors aren't engaging in that.
Yes.
So you've got these many factors that are coming to bear at the same time. They're putting different pressures on the economy. If you are a distributor and you want to get started with scenario planning or with war gaming, how would you go about it?
I mean, I think the first step is be open to bringing in outside expertise that you don't have in-house, right? There's nothing wrong with saying, I don't know everything about everything, and you bring in trade specialists or supply chain specialists. I mean, the work that I'm doing with my brother Eugene, who works for a geopolitical think tank out of Washington, D.C., involves this exact kind of strategic planning and rationale. In fact, we're putting on a simulation for the Washington Post and their strategic council later this week that looks at what happens if trade between the US and China fully breaks down. How do companies respond? And the questions that we put to these decision makers are things like, okay, what are the decision vectors where you can actually have some influence? So we ask questions about how do you want to respond on inventory? Keep it the same as current, lower it by 10%, And we talk about the pros and cons of doing that, the gains on inventory holding costs, but the dissatisfaction that you see from your customers because they don't have availability of product the way that they normally would. Or do you do something more extreme, just in time potentially, versus having a bulk of inventory you increase by 50% to make sure that you don't run out, right? We talk about specific strategies like, do we want to prioritize high value customers and have a separate cache of inventory set aside for them, but treat the rest of our business lineup in a different manner, right? So there's all of these different scales of response that you can do, but you've got to be thinking through it. A lot of times you need external expertise to guide you through that process the same way that you would with a doctor or a lawyer, right?
Sure.
And that's the kind of behavior that businesses need to be engaging with, because to your point, large companies oftentimes have internal teams that specialize in doing this. The bulk of businesses in America, the small and medium-sized companies, they don't. It's oftentimes the owner, the CEO, the CFO that have to do this kind of thing, and they're just not equipped because they haven't had to do it in the past.
Yeah, and they haven't done it before. They also don't have access to the data, and they don't have the expertise necessarily to dial it in specifically to their industry. Right. So, for example, a lot of building materials are made domestically. Right. So windows and doors and roofing and insulation and siding are often manufactured domestically. The labor content in the manufacturing process is often lower in some of those industries because they're process manufacturing, they're petroleum based, and obviously we have a lot of petroleum generated in the US or produced in the US. But then if you get into MRO, where a lot of the products are actually imported, you're dealing with two very different timelines in your supply chain for forecasting. So it's not 6 weeks, it's 6 months. And that means the level of uncertainty increases. Just mathematically, it's harder to forecast your own inventory that far out. Then you have these supply chain issues and these tariff issues that complicate it further. I would say very few distributors have the in-house expertise to do that kind of scenario or plan or wargaming. And so, you know, if they were to call in you and Eugene, and I don't want to make this a commercial, but I am curious, what is your process? I mean, how would you, if you were, let's say you were hired by $1 billion electrical distributor to help them walk through this scenario, what does the process look like?
Yeah, it's very customized, very specific to the nature of that industry. So we try to lay out a hypothetical scenario that might come to pass. Then we try to understand the implications at the general industry and business level, then at the specific company level based on where their footprint is, who their customers are, what vertical markets they're serving, and then at the product line level. So we go into components and materials, where are they being sourced from, what potential tariffs or geopolitical events might be causing those supply chains to be at risk, right? And we really make it all about that company's business. We oftentimes ourselves have to bring in external expertise to facilitate that. And then again, the real conversation is centered around what are the actual levers that you can pull to affect the situation, right? So we talked about inventory levels, pricing response is another one that we look at carefully, customer prioritization, stratification of your customer base into these are the ones that are really important. This is the long tail of the kind of one-off orders, catalog type of orders. We look at supply chain diversification initiatives, right? Do you start exploring doing business with suppliers in South America as a means of kind of offsetting some of the risk in Middle East and Asia right now, right? Because the choke points of the world's trade right now tend to be concentrated in Middle East and Asia. Now, there is kind of some shift that's happening right now. Panama Canal is a really great example of that in the Americas, specifically with trade, US, Canada, Mexico bringing in stuff through the canal. Prior to the war, the cost of a ship transiting the Panama Canal was about $150,000 per vessel. Now it's 3 to 4 times that, almost $500,000. And traffic is still up over 80% because of the risk premium that exists on Middle Eastern and Asia Trans-Pacific shipping right now too. So these are the kind of things that we really have to connect specifically to the business. And I can give you a specific industry example. We recently worked with a Canadian aerospace company that does both military and commercial applications. at some point, President Trump said something along the lines of, well, we really shouldn't have foreign companies involved in the US military and defense space. And so they wanted to explore divestiture options. What do we do with our business that is so heavily tied into Northrop Grumman or Lockheed Martin? And if we can't serve those customers anymore because President Trump said you're not allowed to do that, what does that mean to us? So it's that kind of very specific, very targeted approach that has to be taken into account for during this scenario planning sessions.
Do you think there will be any longer term relief because the tariffs are actually causing manufacturing to onshore to the US? And to qualify that, I fully agree that there's competitive risk with us having certain categories of products produced outside of the United States. Semiconductors, for example, defense components. I'm not sure I would think that Canada's a risk, but maybe if they're coming from China, for example, then that would be a risk. The question is, do those tariffs actually have the effect of bringing manufacturing back into the United States? And if so, will that happen in a time frame that even makes its way into a wargaming analysis for whatever time horizon you do that planning over?
Well, so typically when we do war games, they're concentrated in the 12 to 24 month window, meaning that there's a pre-planning session that says there's some rumblings about developments. What do we need to start to put in place? And then there's a crisis escalation that happens, and we actually respond more forcefully, right? To cut in trade of 50%, for example, semiconductor exports from Taiwan into the US as a result of something the Chinese did. So I think that there is some evidence that reshoring is happening in America. How much of that evidence can you put at the feet of President Trump's tariff policy? I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm guessing that it's not as significant as what he touts it to be, right? I mean, we keep hearing about these trillions of dollars of investments coming in, and there is, TSMC is building a facility in Arizona, and some of the Japanese car makers are trying to build plants here. Hyundai, right? They brought over a lot of their expertise, but then President Trump's immigration policy, ICE agents went in and deported half of the people that they brought in, right? So there is a mixed and sometimes contradictory agenda that's in play that doesn't always allow the stated outcome to manifest in the way that it was envisioned, I think. So yes, it is happening. I think that it would be fair to say that it's happening on a slower time scale than President Trump would like to see it. Yeah. These are projects that are years in the making. I mean, aluminum is a really good example. Many industrial companies use aluminum. We don't produce much aluminum in this country because of how energy intensive that process is. That's why Canada is a major source of aluminum for us. They have lower cost hydropower. They do a lot of smelting up there and then export aluminum to the US. But it takes 3, 5, 7 years to stand up a new aluminum smelting facility. This is not an overnight process. And so, yes, there is some of that industry coming back to the United States, but it's a medium to long-term play rather than an immediate-term play, which is sometimes the way that it's touted.
Got it. Okay, so let's switch to another topic, and one that you and I have had a lot of fun arguing about. And I mean it, it's a very entertaining argument for me, which is the impact of AI on jobs. And so you've recently pulled some data about this, and you published the data and asked me to respond. I haven't yet, so we'll do it here. Obviously the sort of context or the larger argument is over whether or not AI will create more jobs than it destroys, which has been for absolutely certainly the history of technology. In the long run, in the short run, it creates a lot of unemployment in certain sectors and isolated sectors, but in the long run, the job numbers are vastly increased because of technology. So you can debate how you get through the transition, which can be challenging and difficult, especially for certain types of jobs and certain people. But in the long run, it's always created more jobs than it's destroyed. And you and I have talked about, well, will AI follow that pattern? So you go first. Tell me, what's your basic opinion on the subject? and share with us some of the data that you have put together to support your point of view.
Sure. I think it's important when talking on this topic to look at it in terms of short term, medium term, and long term. So in the short term, there's a lot of fervor, a lot of pitch right now about AI is taking everybody's jobs. We're telling college graduates that they might as well just call it a day because AI is going to be taking all their jobs, which is creating a really interesting adversarial relationship for the younger generation with AI. I've talked to you about some of the things that my daughter has told me, who's 16, and the way that she views AI, and I can tell you it's not in a very positive light, and I think a lot of her generation share that assessment. But if you talk about data, first of all, when I look at layoffs in the American job market, there's no evidence that there's any notable increase since the introduction of ChatGPT and some of these other models. It's basically been below pre-COVID levels in terms of layoff activity. So, at the big scale, we can say AI is not taking people's jobs in a massive way right now. If you look a little bit more honed in, the software sector, obviously one of the most disrupted by that because of AI's ability to write code. And there's been massive layoffs, Meta, Adobe, Amazon,
Salesforce,
Microsoft. I mean, the list goes on. Google, right? But we're talking about a combined amount of layoffs that's somewhere in the 100 to 150,000 from all of these announcements comprehensively. Keep in mind the total size of the job market in the United States is 165 million, give or take. And so 150,000, very painful for those individuals.
Yes.
A drop in the bucket relative to the overall job market. So I think at least in the short term, we can say it's not immediately displacing people at scale. Medium term for me, I think really the question becomes, can you have AI interface with the physical world the way that it is currently affecting the virtual world, right? And so it's the cross-section of AI and robotics that I find to be very interesting. And there's obviously a lot of work happening in both fields. Now, the Chinese are leaders in robotics implementation and installations. There's some really interesting data coming out of China in terms of they're actually starting to roll out at least prototypes of machines, for example, for servicing the electric grid in remote areas of China where people would have to go to in the past, but now they can send these autonomous vehicles to go and do much of the MRO repair and maintenance work in place of people. So can we get the cost of robotics low enough and the right applications in place and then overlay AI on top of that to where they're going to be able to do the jobs that people physically have to do today? I think the answer, in my view, is probably that's going to happen at some point. It's very difficult for me to envision reasons why that doesn't happen. There's enough investment, there's enough interest in doing that. In some fields, like healthcare, for example, that we just don't have the number of people that are needed, right? Especially when you think about things like in-home care for the elderly, right? We have a world population that's aging dramatically. We have not enough support for the elderly. A lot of times they're living by themselves, don't have the kind of support systems that they need. So I can get behind that notion of, a humanoid robot in the home to help administer medicine, to help bathe the person, right? It's a very logical, very kind of humane way to think about that. But that does mean that those jobs are going to be displaced, in my view. So medium term, I would say, when I say medium term, 10, 15 years, I do think that we have more disruptive type of impact on the jobs market. But I find that type of time frame, the 10 to 15 year period, gives us time to adjust and answer the questions of, if you don't have to do the menial tasks, the physically demanding tasks, what else can humans do to add value, right? And I think that increasingly I come back to the logic that it is the liberal arts, the creative aspect of what humans do, that is going to become more and more valuable over time. Because if you think about the way that a large language model, any of these ChatGPT or Claude or Perplexity or whatever it is, that how they operate, they all use data inputs of what has already happened. It is very difficult for them to envision things that have never happened before, and they never make those recommendations, by the way. They very rarely come up with unique things that have not been done by humans before as a novel idea. So I think that if we can continue to engage with our creativity and ingenuity and come up with new solutions, I think we'll be okay as far as the labor force. It's going to look drastically different than it does today. In fact, I think that by the time we get to the mid-2030s, many of the jobs that people are doing then don't look anything like the jobs that they're doing right now. We have to continue to evolve. But that doesn't mean that the disruption isn't there. So the question is, for me, about how do we take this opportunity to continue to be engaged and contribute value to the world in an environment where the nature of the work that we do has to fundamentally adapt to this cross-section of AI and robotics. And then longer term, the conversation has to turn to, general intelligence, right? It cannot be these language models anymore. It has to be something that is truly not just more capable at scale in terms of compute processing power, but the ability to generate these new ideas. There is no evidence right now that that's happening. I think that the human imagination tends to run wild, and I think that it is possible for that to happen. One of my favorite movies, if you had a chance to check it out, Chappie. It's a great film about a robot that basically his maker allows him consciousness. And so the robot becomes almost like a newborn baby when it becomes self-aware, and then it learns over time, and it's this great story. But I think that when we explore the idea of a artificial general intelligence, then I think things can get a lot more dire, and some of these more apocalyptic scenarios in terms of jobs do come into being. Because an AI that can outthink you and do that at scale and faster and 24/7 all the time, and come up with new ideas, then it's a completely different conversation. So break it up into these timelines, and I think that there's a lot to talk about at every stage of the process.
Yeah, that's a very thoughtful perspective, and actually not that much different than mine. So I think looking at job layoff data today, I agree with you, it's not very alarming. I mean, 165,000 layoffs, the economy frequently creates more jobs than that in a month. Right. So that, and again, not to minimize the challenges or trauma for those people, because it's a terrible thing to lose your job, but as a part of a job market the size of the United States, it's not a significant number.
Yeah.
But a lot of times what happens early in a technology transformation is different than the long-term effect. So I remember when people began using a lot of personal computers, and they started talking about the paperless office. Okay. Well, that's not what happened at first. At first, people printed everything because that's how they've been used to seeing it, and paper consumption skyrocketed because people were buying all this copy paper. It's only later that, as people began to be used to using Word documents and PDFs and PowerPoint presentations, that they stopped printing so much as the new methods took hold and became more culturally common. Right. And so I think what's happening with jobs right now on a larger scale, it could well be that there's not much impact right now, or even that AI is creating more jobs, and that doesn't necessarily predict what will happen in the long run. My primary concern, this is sort of a philosophical argument, I guess, or a macro argument, is that I'm well aware of the history of technology generally creating more jobs than it destroys. And I think AI may do that as well, except that those new jobs may be taken by AI, because it's the first technology ever that's literally more capable than human beings at a wide scale of activities. I mean, if AI is literally smarter than humans at most tasks, and then you add the robotics to it, which I agree is potentially a tipping point, then you may well see AI be the first technology that's positioned to create new jobs that it can do better than the technology that created those new jobs. So that worries me quite a bit. Now, there are two Stanford economists. I sent you a videotape of one of them. It really supports your point of view. And I can't remember the term he uses.
It basically talked about that AI can automate most of a single process, but not all of it. And it's that 20 to 30% of the process that it can't automate that is the hope of humanity, basically, in terms of job preservation.
Yeah, and I thought it was a very thoughtful argument. I don't know that I agree with it, but I thought it was very thoughtful. And my confidence in my point of view is not that great, right? So I think I have a point of view, but I'm not trying to advocate it as a certainty, because it's really not. I think in the long run, it's very murky to try to predict what's going to happen. But I do agree that as AI learns to move in the physical world, that's one tipping point. But another tipping point to me is AI is really only now becoming recursive in its development, where it can improve on its own. I mean, that's the nature of AI anyway, it improves on its own. But now it's actually learning to improve on its own at a faster rate than humans could improve it at. And so that makes me wonder if the acceleration in the improvement of AI will go faster than society's ability to adapt to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a very valid point, especially when it comes to exponential growth projections, right? Humans are notoriously very bad at looking at an exponential curve and trying to project forward into the future. We're very good at turning around, looking back at the curve and explaining how we got to where we are, but then we turn this way and the curve is staring us right in the face.
Right.
And so it's very difficult to project. I think that the key for anyone that's really worried about this particular topic is to stay informed as much as you can. Pay attention, continue to be open to evolving and growing yourself. I can tell you, I use AI in the work that I do, but not to write any of the commentary or analysis, but for some of the simulations that we run, we actually compare the decisions made by the humans to what an AI model would decide in the same scenario. And we talk about the pros and cons of each approach. And the conclusion we oftentimes come to is it's not a replacement, but rather a complement. You want to have an AI tool that you can use to supplement the strategic thinking of a person, but you don't want to replace the human thinking with that of an AI. So, I think that people will continue to look for ways to use AI for new business formation. There's some great data that supports this. For example, filings with the Small Business Administration of new companies are running at double the rate of the pre-AI era right now. So there's a lot of companies being formed to take advantage of AI and bring a new product or service offering to the market using AI technologies. And of course, you guys at DSG do a great job of covering that in your events that you run, the AI for Distributors Conference. I had the pleasure of speaking at this year's event, and I know you're expanding to Atlanta and the UK as well. So I think that would be my biggest point to the audience is this notion of don't have earmuffs and blinders on, continue to be open to the idea of growth in this area, and that will allow you to not only focus on the risks, but on the opportunities as well.
Yeah, and one thing I tell distributors, because distributors tend to be very good employers. They're often very family oriented, and they're worried about, hey, if I implement this AI, it could wind up with me laying people off. And what I tell them is, look, if you don't employ AI and your competitors do, you may put yourself in a position where you're not employing anyone because you're no longer in business. And so you're much better off employing AI, growing your company to protect your people, and letting other people deal with the problem of I'm losing share rather than dealing with it yourself.
Yeah. But of course, as you very eloquently stated many times yourself, you have to find the right applications, right? There's a lot of companies out there that are fluff. They just stamp AI on the back of a different word, and then all of a sudden their valuation goes through the roof, right? So you got to find those use cases where it actually makes sense, that are practical and pragmatic. And there are some out there for sure. They're not as widespread as what the AI companies would lead you to believe, though.
Sure. Yeah, and the market's going to sort that out.
Yeah.
So.
Agreed.
Well, Alex, this has been a terrific conversation. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And thanks to the audience. I hope this was a useful discussion for you. We always look forward to your comments. So if you're watching on LinkedIn, on YouTube, or on our website, please make comments. We do we take every effort to make sure we respond. So thanks again, Alex.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.